and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Leading us in, as always, with their rendition of Eno Marconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar singers like you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. And in tonight's podcast, the Cowboys vs. Nazi action continues in Chapter 14 of Paris High Noon. If you're a big fan of cowboys and dead Nazis, then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Pick up a paperback or download the ebook at ParisHighNoon.com. T-shirts, sodas, and other swag are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. Paris High Noon and the Mustache T-shirts are available at Society6.com/TrentTano. Thank you again to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really brings it alive. So without further ado, here is Chapter 14 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 14, The Outlaw Trail. Well, I guess this is where we find out if we're cowboys, Catfish said. The swift, deep-running Loire cut through the Val d'Anjou near Angers to the west and the Val de Touraine near Tours in the east. Both cities were bustling with Wehrmacht troopers who beat the bocage in search of the outlaws. They had hoped to kill their way to Catfish by executing hostages and anyone else they felt like killing. For the outlaws, that type of tenacity made the summer nights cruelly short and the days fearfully long. Crossing the Loire into Vichy didn't mean they could take it easy. Vichy liked to call itself Free France, but there was nothing free about it. The Germans could cross over at any time, kicking down doors with their jackboots, while Vichy looked the other way. So the people kept quiet, not wanting to give reason to the Wehrmacht to come in. The outlaws didn't know if their wanted posters were hung in the hamlets and villages in Vichy. Their only hope was getting to the border. But looking at the Loire, Spain might as well have been the moon. In the summer storm, the river ran strong and high, full of floating debris. It reminded Catfish of crossing the Red, a river that killed many a cowboy. While trying to slip between a posse out of Abilene, Catfish had let go of the pack horse with the loot in order to survive. Arriving in Mexico with only a quarter of the money he stole, that was long ago. Now he was old, with a green crew who needed all their strength and concentration to keep from falling off their horses. Maybe we should keep going upriver, Quick Billy said. That means going east, St. Jude said. That's where the Boche are. Hell, the Boche are all around us, Louis said. You can't whip out your pecker and piss without wetting one. God's pissing on us all, Hammer said, while wiping the wet from his face. He doesn't give a shit about the French or the Boche. No other place to cross, Barnaby said. Any further up and we hit the fork of the Loire and the Cher. And then we're really in a pinch, Catfish added. At least we'll die rich, St. Jude said. Although I wish we had a chance to spend some of that money. It was true, they were richer. Jean had made a lucky grab with most of the sacks he pulled from the safe, holding tens of thousands of Reichsmarks. They could live easy in sunny Spain until someone finally won the war. All right, Catfish said. I'll go in first. Jean and Hammer, take the right point. St. Jude and Louis on the left. Barnaby and Quick Billy will take drag. Keep the pack horses in the middle, and don't let them float past or behind. Keep it tight and don't panic. Quickest way to die is to panic in a river on a horse. Catfish wanted to cross the river at an angle where it bent near the South Fork. Although it would cut the distance, it also meant the river would be swifter. Catfish rode the Black Arabian straight into the river. The big horse swam like a fish, but the other horses shied away once they got chest deep and then tried to get back to the bank. They were bred for harness racing, not swimming rivers. And they were so worn out already that if they made the crossing, they'd be ruined for at least a week. Catfish turned the Arabian back and took the reins of the lead pack horse. The rest followed. The gang took the river like a cat taking a bath. All of them, to a man, would rather have faced steel panzer shells than the dark waters of the Loire. Hammer's horse balked at first, and the big brigand used every unpleasant word he had picked up on the streets of Paris to fully express himself to his mount. Jean rode up and took the reluctant horse's reins. Hammer wanted to thank the younger Malheur, but cold water hitting his nuts and then his chest sucked the compliment from his lungs. St. Jude and Louis didn't fare much better, but a few swipes of the reins and prods with the spur finally got their soap factories to take the river's full depth. The horses floundered in the current. Quick Billy grabbed the reins, hoping it would somehow keep him from dying, but it only caused the horses to attempt to turn around. Catfish hollered at Quick Billy to loosen his grip on the reins, but fear struck him deaf to the cries of the horses. The current seemed determined to drag them all to the bottom of the muddy river. Catfish yelled again, and this time Quick Billy loosened his grip. No sooner had Quick Billy righted himself than two pack horses slipped between Jean and Hammer, and with them the loot from the bank robbery. "Barnaby," Catfish yelled, "you and the rest keep the horses together and get the other side without drowning." Catfish turned the Arabian and went for the lost pack horses. The Arabian was able to pull out in front, and Catfish grabbed the reins of one, but not the other. The river took the pack horse and the money it carried into the darkness. The old cowboy chalked it up to a loss and made for the far banks. When they hit the south bank, both men and mounts were ruined. One by one, the gang flopped off their horses and fell to the ground. Louis began to vomit. Quick Billy jumped off his saddle once horse hooves touched terra firma. "I thought I was going to die in that fucking river." "We will if we don't get moving," Hammer said. It was true. They were wet to the bone and liable to catch a worse chill. "Well, let's ride," Louis said. "You walk," Catfish ordered. "The horses are more tired than you, and besides, if you ride, you might catch a chill that won't leave." The old cowboy had seen men die after riding through a cold river and not lighting a fire. Once he came across a pale rider and tried to strike up a conversation, only to realize the man had froze dead in the saddle. Barnaby came up from the rear. "We just lost that one horse." "I wonder how much money went down river," St. Jude said. "Count your blessings that none of us got sucked under," Catfish said. "Now let's get it going." The outlaws walked hard and fast in the short summer night, following the Vienne River, skirting the low wooded hills southwest of Chinon, up into the vast open plateau of the Berry countryside. As dawn approached, the outlaws found themselves in a thick wooded hollow. They huddled around the small fire, but it was about as useful as getting warm next to a glacier. So they passed around a bottle of wine to warm their bellies as the chill of the river seeped into their bones. Too tired to speak, let alone argue, the men passed out. By late afternoon, the men had warmed up enough to choke down some tinned meat, which they washed down with generous amounts of wine before breaking camp and saddling up the horses at a pace that matched their mood. "You boys are moving like Montana pond water in the wintertime," Catfish said. "This ain't no lunchbox social. We're on." In spite of his tongue lashing, Catfish was the slowest mover of the bunch, riding drag while it seemed everyone else was out on point. Every joint in his body felt like it held a barrel of glue. To make it worse, he had run out of Kentucky amber and needed a touch of the brown to help clean the gunk out of his veins. Jean noticed the old cowboy's trouble and did his best to help by breaking camp and taking care of the horses. Catfish appreciated the attention, but it wounded his pride some. "So, which way we go?" St. Jude asked. There was some discussion on making a straight line for the Spanish border through the flat Bordeaux countryside. Catfish objected, since it would expose them to the occupied Atlantic zone and also people. "Better to head for the high country," Catfish said. He had outrun the law for so many decades that he did consider himself a professor on the subject. The rest of the gang grudgingly accepted the old cowboy's judgment on the matter. And the matter was closed. They would work their way up towards the Massif Central, the great upland country that had few folks and plenty of places to hide. They walked the horses through the thickets and brambles that stitched the open fields. As dusk settled, the crew broke out of the forest. The light of the half moon and bright stars illuminated the open pastures as they trudged across the golden wheat fields with the dim lights of Châteauroux simmering in the distant west. They walked all night, making good ground, but the summer nights were short, and after covering 15 miles, they made camp in a narrow gully near the Creuse River. They didn't bother to eat since exhaustion had overtaken hunger by 100 miles. They sacked out in a grove of ferns and slept till late afternoon under the poplar's cool shade. By the time they woke up, the sun was slowly setting along the spiny Hauteurs de Catine. Louis and Quick Billy cooked up a stew made of tinned meat along with some wild tubers and an onion. No one said a word unless it was to complain, but even that was beginning to wear itself out. By the fifth sunset, they could see the peaks of the Massif Central floating like islands above the clouds. High cliffs and deep gorges slowed their progress. The upside was there were very few people about, so they took to traveling more in the daylight to make up for the lost mileage. Their time in Normandy couldn't compare with the heavy grind that greeted them each day in the high country. It was all the gang could do to put one foot in front of the next. Catfish had a hard time on the trail. Every day he got older. It was the one law he couldn't outrun. By the 9th day since the crossing, his eyelids were so heavy he took to walking with them closed whenever they hit a flat stretch of the trail. Catfish made more miles in his mind than on his feet. He thought of old times on the lam, and Lee showing up in that trapper's lean-to when he was about ready to give himself up to the wolves. This was just the kind of tight spot Lee would have helped him out of. Catfish couldn't count all the times Lee saved his life. But the old cowboy was so used to Lee coming to the rescue that it didn't surprise him when his pard strode right up next to him, leading a painted Mustang by the bridle, looking as young as the day they met in the Dakota plains so long ago. "Looks like you got yourself in another pickle there, pard," Lee said. Catfish smiled. "I've been in so many pickles I'll die well preserved." Lee laughed. It was always good to hear that deep, hearty song when riding hard along the trail. "Remember that time we rustled 100 head from the Rockin' J Ranch?" Lee asked. 2 weeks cutting through the desert, lost 15 beeves, and got a measly $20 for the both of us. You made one lousy capitalist. "Well, it was our first time rustling," Catfish said. "Hell, at least we didn't get caught. If we would have tried to grab beef from the lazy Q like you wanted, we would have had some short carries as rustlers." The smile went away from Lee's face, leaving deep wrinkles etched in the skin. "We all get caught." Catfish sighed at the memory. Lee killed a drunk who couldn't take losing his money to a black man. It was plain self-defense, but the law was looking for any excuse to put the outlaws away, and a black man killing a white was as good as any. "You should have let me and the boys bust you out of that plank board jail," Catfish said. "It wasn't worth you, Professor Brown, hell, even Petey McCourt getting shot at. Still, 10 years in the Army. It wasn't too bad. Bad food and long hours in the saddle. Hell, it was just like our rustling days. Besides, it helped you out." Catfish nodded his tired head in agreement. When Lee went into the Army, things went pretty far south for a while. One day, the Texas Rangers caught Catfish rustling cattle. With the noose draped around Catfish's neck, Captain Bloodsmore was about to tie off one end of the rope to the only tree within 100 miles, when a freak storm blew in from the south. A bolt of lightning hit the posse, and Catfish's horse ran off into the desert. He wandered for days with his hands tied behind his back and the rope trailing like a wild whip. 2 days later, a troop from the 10th Cavalry, Lee's regiment, spotted him while on their way to San Antonio. Catfish took the opportunity to dodge Texas law and signed up with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders to go fight the Spanish in Cuba. "That was a hot time in the old town, wasn't it?" Catfish said. "I admit I was scared," Lee said. His pace slowed. "Not as scared as I was here." The light happiness Catfish felt from his old friend turned into a heavy guilt. Tears rolled out of his eyes. His throat choked up, and he said the words he wanted to say for over 20 years. "I'm sorry, Lee. I swear I tried to find you. I looked everywhere until they told me I couldn't look no more." "I know," Lee said. "You tried, and that's all any of us can really do." Catfish took a deep breath and let it out. "What happened to you?" Lee shook his head. "I don't rightly know myself. One minute I see you take off playing dodge the bull with them shells. The next I'm back home on the plains just as the morning sun hits the dew on the sage." Lee stopped. The painted Mustang grew restless and the wind picked up. "Gotta go now, old pard," Lee said. Catfish stopped too. The black Arabian pointed his ears at Lee. "Will I see you again?" Lee laughed his deep laugh. He mounted the pain as if he'd been doing it all of his life. "What makes you think you're going to live forever?" With that, Lee and the paint rode off into the brush. Catfish let go of the Arabian and ran after Lee, who left no track and made no trail. The old cowboy stumbled and would have fallen if it weren't for Jean, who had kept an eye on Catfish as he went in and out of his daydreams. "You okay?" Jean asked. Catfish leaned on Jean as he got his footing back. "Sorry about that. I still might be able to rob a bank, but I'm too old to take the trail and outrun a posse." Jean looked around. They were among a tangle of forest and brush, with a bubbling creek that crept through a small clearing. The outlaws had crested the high country following the Vizier River southeast as it cut a path between the Plateau de Millevache and the rolling hills of Limousin. "Let's make camp," John said to Catfish. The old cowboy didn't argue. It was turning into a nice, lazy day. Green grasshoppers jumped about, while the poplar and elms stretched their branches, tickling the sunlight as it fell on the men. After a long sleep, the crew woke up to find the summer sun ambling along the mid-afternoon sky. Barnaby got a fire going, and Quick Billy started to make a pot of stew, while the rest of the crew lazed around. Jean sat apart from the others. The tough ride had put his melancholy riding drag, but now that his mind could sit still, the low feeling had rode back to the top. Patrice's death flashed before Jean's eyes in tintype every time he blinked. Growing up, it seemed that nobody trusted nobody, and if trusting strangers was dangerous during peacetime, that went double for war. But at the end of the day, Jean had to trust someone. He trusted Catfish, yet it was hard for Jean to be a boy around him. With Patrice, he could hold on to some of those simple boyish things. Now the Germans had taken that away too. Catfish had slept most of the day and was feeling much more like himself, though his body still ached like it was one solid bruise. He had noticed the boy's sadness throughout the trail and understood the guilt Jean carried, even if there was nothing he could have done for his friend. Catfish had left Lee behind, and he still carried that burden. There was no telling how long Jean would carry Patrice. Each man must suffer in his own way until he found redemption. Catfish hoped it wouldn't take Jean as long to find it. Under the cool shade of the poplars, Catfish sat down next to the boy and put his arm around him. "Sorry about Patrice." Jean's brown eyes grew misty. I don't want to be thought of as weak because of it. Catfish sighed. Son, feelings don't make you weak. They just make you human. Talking tough doesn't necessarily make you tough. Most bandits use violence and the threat of it as a way to mask their fears. It's mostly bluff, and once you've been around it long enough, you're able to tell if the fellow opposite you is going to fold or slap leather. Like St. Jude and Hammer? For the most part, yeah. Don't get me wrong. They're tough when they have to be, but they mostly insult each other as a way to keep the peace. Telling a man to go to hell is a lot different than sending him there. Those fellows who draw at the merest slight are the ones you need to be wary of. Those are men without any feelings, let alone tender ones. Them fellows don't last long in this line of work. And I hope you don't become one of them, Catfish thought. It's just that I miss him. We all miss him. Maybe not in the deep way you do, but he is missed. Jean looked away. When there's water to be fetched or wood to be gathered, he's missed. These boys aren't used to tender ways, Catfish said. What they're giving you is the best they got. Don't ask for more. Jean closed his eyes and squeezed out a few tears. Have you ever lost someone like Patrice? Jean asked. Catfish's mustache sagged around the corner of his mouth. Yes, I have. And more than once. How do you deal with it? You don't. You just live and regret and try to accept it. I don't think I ever will. I wish this war never happened. I wish... Jean was about to say he wished he never saw Catfish, but he couldn't blame Catfish for any of the bad things that had happened since the old cowboy was responsible for most of the good. Catfish held Jean a little tighter in his arm. Son, I won't always be there to make things better for you. I can teach you how to shoot a gun, but I can't tell you when and where you should point it. These tools of the trade you're learning can lead you down a dark path that few ever come back from. He pointed at Jean's pistol. That's God's judgment you got tucked in your trousers. But that don't make you God. You have to decide. Patrice's death isn't supposed to make things easier. Hell, life ain't here to make things easier. You have to decide how much of a burden you're willing to bear. Catfish put his hand on Jean's knee and let it linger for a moment. The rest of the crew lay out and snored. The horses foraged in the lush grass. Gnats and skeeters buzzed about in the warm air.
And welcome back to the Strange West Podcast. Once again, this is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trent Tano. Well, that about does it for the Cowboys versus Nazi action in Chapter 14 of Paris High Noon. Don't forget, you can get a copy today at parishighnoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at parishighnoon.com. T-shirts are also available through society6.com/Trentano. Paris High Noon T-shirts, as well as the mustache T-shirts, are available at society6.com. And thank you once again to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And sending us out, as always, with their rendition of Eno Morricone's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. Please go check them out at mitchpolzak.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Happy trails.